Welcome to Iraqi Dinar Update, your go-to source for the latest news, expert insights, and real-time developments on Iraq's currency, economy, and financial reforms. Whether you're a long-time investor or just curious about the dinar, you're in the right place. When analyzing the current economic trajectory of certain countries undergoing monetary reform, particularly Iraq in this context, it becomes increasingly evident that two core components are deeply intertwined with what experts refer to as exchange rate orientation. These components may include regulatory frameworks, digital infrastructure, compliance systems, and fiscal readiness, among other technical and policy-based aspects. Though they are sometimes discussed in isolation, like advancements in digital banking, anti-money laundering mechanisms, or increased financial transparency, they cannot be divorced from the larger question of how a nation manages the value of its currency in both domestic and international markets. The concept of exchange rate orientation refers to the strategic stance or policy posture a country takes toward determining the value of its currency. This can be through a fixed rate, a floating rate, a crawling peg, or a managed float. But what's key to understand here is that many of the ongoing reforms we are witnessing are not independent of, but rather preparatory for, an eventual change in that very orientation. So when observers say that a country hasn't done certain things yet, or hasn't finished certain initiatives, they are pointing to the reality that some reforms are still underway. And it's important not to interpret this delay as incompetence or failure. Rather, it may signal deliberate timing. The implementation of many of these financial, legal, and infrastructural systems is aligned with a much broader and more consequential policy shift, namely, the realignment or revaluation of the country's exchange rate. In other words, the timing of these reforms may be intentionally staggered so that their completion coincides with or immediately precedes a fundamental shift in how the currency is valued or traded. Let's take Iraq as a working example, though this principle could apply to other transitioning economies as well. Iraq has been engaged in a prolonged process of monetary reform ever since the early 2000s. Over the years, we've seen various steps aimed at modernizing its banking system, securing its reserves, digitalizing its payments infrastructure, enhancing regulatory compliance with global standards, and establishing closer working relationships with institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and FATF. However, despite all this movement, some of the most important milestones, like full integration into SWIFT systems, foreign investment confidence, or open currency convertibility, have not yet been fully achieved. For those watching this process from the outside, it may seem perplexing. If the country has been working on reforms for over a decade, why aren't these final steps completed? The answer lies in understanding that these milestones are not just boxes to be checked, they are mechanisms that interact deeply with how a currency functions in the world. And many of these mechanisms only become functional, relevant, or even possible when a country is ready to make a major change in its exchange rate. Simply put, the reforms are structured to mature around the same time that the exchange rate itself is altered. It's not that the country is behind schedule or incapable of completing them, it's that their utility is contingent on a new rate being in place. That's why it's logical to expect that these reforms might remain unfinished until the actual moment of exchange rate change arrives. There's also a political and economic logic at play here. Currency revaluation is not merely a technical event. It's a strategic move that requires timing, coordination, and a supportive macroeconomic environment. If a country is planning to significantly adjust its exchange rate, whether to float its currency or reset its peg, it must ensure that the underlying infrastructure is ready to handle the new regime. That includes having strong central bank reserves, robust anti-corruption frameworks, digitized banking services, secure cross-border payment systems, and legal alignment with global trade and finance norms. All of these systems work in concert to maintain stability once the exchange rate changes. But to put these systems into full operation prematurely, before the rate changes, could expose the country to risk. For example, without a new exchange rate, liberalizing capital controls could lead to currency flight. Or without proper digital banking laws, opening up to international investors might invite money laundering. So reforms are carefully paced to align with the larger strategic shift. There's also a psychological component. Domestic and international confidence in a currency is a delicate thing. A sudden move toward currency revaluation, in the absence of visible reform, could trigger speculation, hoarding, or even panic. On the other hand, implementing all reforms too early, without following through on the rate change, could lead to stagnation, skepticism, or investor fatigue. Thus, timing becomes a matter of psychology as much as policy. Stakeholders need to see a coherent sequence. Furthermore, the delay or deliberate pacing of reforms can be seen as a form of strategic patience. It signals that the country is aware of the stakes involved and is not willing to make a hasty move that could backfire. It's a form of institutional discipline, where decision-makers are committed to creating not just the appearance of reform, but the actual capacity to sustain a reformed system. So when analysts say that certain actions haven't been finished, it's not necessarily a critique. It's an observation that those actions are logically tethered to a larger transformation that hasn't happened yet, but is expected. And it would be premature to complete them in isolation from that transformation. This leads us to the conclusion that, yes, the two things being discussed, whatever they may be in a given analysis, whether technological, legal, or institutional, are indeed tied to exchange rate orientation. And no, they haven't been completed yet. But rather than interpreting that as a setback or failure, we should recognize it as an intentional sequencing decision. These pieces are part of a larger puzzle, and they are being positioned to activate only when the currency is ready to change. Until that change occurs, until the country shifts its monetary regime, either by revaluing its currency or adjusting its exchange rate mechanism, those last few steps may remain in a holding pattern. In other words, the unfinished business of reform is not an accident. It's a feature of a broader strategy. And this strategy likely culminates in a very specific event, the moment the exchange rate changes. When that moment comes, we should expect the previously unfinished components to fall into place rapidly, because they were never meant to exist fully independent of that final shift. They were preparatory all along. They are waiting for the new rate, and once that rate appears, they will be activated in full. Until then, the delay is not a sign of failure, it's a sign of focus. Thanks for tuning into Iraqi Dinar Update. If you found this content helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a beat on Iraq's evolving financial landscape. Stay informed, and stay ready.